One of the most infamous and notorious kings to ever rule over England was Henry VIII. He's mostly remembered for the fact he had 6 wives, and in recent years, their reputations have been through a significant amount of questioning and reform. Some who were judged as harlots of the 16th century today are considered victims of their husbands, the very man who many were forced into marrying. Each of Henry VIII's 6 wives have incredible stories. Many come from very aristocratic backgrounds and European ruling families, but each had their turbulent relationship with the Tudor king. They all had varying fates, but each succumbed to death in a variety of manners. 2 even lost their heads inside the walls of the Tower of London. In this video documentary, we will outline the fate of each of Henry VIII's wives, and we will look at their causes of death and who was to blame. Welcome to the disturbing post-mortems of Henry VIII's 6 wives. And to support our channel, please subscribe.
Henry VIII's wandering eye and obsession to have a male heir ultimately led to her downfall, and she's a figure who many feel rather sorry for. After Catherine's death, the people of England were plunged into a mourning for the woman they deemed to be the rightful queen and legitimate queen, and she was greatly respected by the population. Today we look at the real cause of death of Catherine of Aragon. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Throughout her life, Catherine of Aragon was a well-respected and revered member of the Tudor aristocracy. Her first marriage to Prince Arthur was short-lived. However, she is mostly remembered for her marriage to Henry VIII, marrying the notorious monarch in 1509. Henry initially greatly respected the Spanish princess, and the early years of their marriage were considered happy, with the royal couple having a daughter, who would later go on to become Queen Mary I, who has also been known in history as Bloody Mary. However, by 1525 the king had developed a strong infatuation with another woman at court that would rip England apart and begin one of the most significant changes ever brought to the country. Due to his obsession with Anne Boleyn, Henry was forced to look for a way out of his first marriage. The Pope refused to annul the marriage between the sovereign and Catherine of Aragon, and for this Henry decided to break from Rome, assuming supremacy over the Church of England. With this, in 1533, it was then declared that the marriage between Catherine and Henry was invalid, with it being declared unlawful, as Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother. Now, before the king's second marriage to Anne Boleyn, Catherine lived in many different palaces where she lived out the rest of her life. She regularly referred to herself as England's only rightful queen, and her servants continued to call her this. She had been given the title the Dowager Princess of Wales, but this was nothing for the once great Catherine. Her final home was Kimbolton Castle, and she was eventually transferred here, keeping herself in one room and living a rather simple life. Here she was banned from seeing her daughter Mary, and was also banned from communicating with her. In December of 1535, Catherine made her will, realising that her death was soon on the horizon, and she wrote to her ex-husband the king one final time. She stated, "My most dear lord, king and husband, the hour of my death now drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me, my case being such to commend myself to you, and to put in remembrance with a few words of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters. For the rest I commend unto you our daughter Mary, beseeching you to be a good father unto her. For all my other servants I solicit the wages due them, and a year more, lest they be unprovided for. Lastly, I make this vow that mine eyes desire you above all things." On the 13th of December 1535, Eustace Chapuis wrote that Catherine had recovered and is now well. But then on the 29th of December, Catherine's doctor sent an urgent message to Chapuis alerting him to the fact that she had a serious relapse, and that he should immediately seek permission from the king to visit Catherine at Kimbolton Castle, and Chapuis did not waste any time. Henry gave Chapuis permission, but did not give Mary, Catherine's daughter, permission. Mary was not allowed to see her mother on her deathbed. You see, Catherine and Mary had such a close bond in Mary's early years. but Catherine was forced to spend her final days without the company of the one she loved most. But Catherine did get a small release, for her best friend Maria de Salinas had gone to great lengths to be by her side. She had disguised herself and had fabricated a story about having fallen off a horse and claimed to be in desperate need of a place in which to recover. The charade seemed to work because the steward allowed her in, and then she proceeded directly to Catherine's chamber. Eustace Chapuis then arrived to see Catherine, but by this point she was very ill and had great difficulty in sitting up, and she hadn't eaten or slept in days, complaining of a terrible pain in her stomach. Another sad point is that whilst Catherine was on her deathbed, Henry VIII insisted there were several witnesses present to the conversations held between Catherine and Eustace Chapuis. This was to ensure there was no plots made against him. Eustace Chapuis then visited Catherine every afternoon for the next 4 days. Initially it seemed that Catherine's health was improving. She was now able to hold down her food, and then on the 4th day Chapuis felt it was safe for him to return to London. But then, on the 6th of January, things took a turn for the worse, and Catherine's condition deteriorated. There is a letter that Catherine wrote to Henry VIII, and this is what she penned: "My most dear lord, king, and husband, the hour of my death now approaching, I cannot choose but, out of the love I bear you, to advise you of your soul's health, which you ought to prefer before all considerations of the world or flesh whatsoever, for which yet you have cast me into many calamities, and yourself into many troubles, but I forgive you all, and pray God to do so likewise. For the rest I commend unto you Mary our daughter, beseeching you to be a good father to her. I must entreat you to also look after my maids, and give them a marriage which is not much, there being but 3, and to all my other servants a year's pay beside their due, lest otherwise they should go unprovided for until they find new employment. Lastly, I want only one true thing, to make this vow, that, in this life, mine eyes desire you alone. May God protect you." Death now had a firm grip upon Catherine, and the Bishop of Llandaff administered extreme unction. Prayer had been Catherine's companion all her life, and now in her final moments it was her only consolation. And then, on the 7th of January, at approximately 2 o'clock, Catherine of Aragon's soul departed this earth, and she left all of her troubles behind. The once Spanish queen had now died, and sadly, Henry's court was now celebrating. Eric Ives claimed that the news of Catherine's death was greeted at the court by an outburst of relief and enthusiasm for the Boleyn marriage. And this seems rather plausible, considering that Queen Anne Boleyn was pregnant with the heir to the Tudor throne. Henry, however, upon hearing the news of the death of Catherine, cried, "God be praised, but we are free from all suspicion of war," and Anne Boleyn was overjoyed and rewarded the messenger who brought the news to Greenwich with a handsome present, because for the first time in her reign Anne Boleyn was now the one and only Queen of England. Upon hearing of his former wife's death, Henry VIII distastefully celebrated her passing, and according to Eustace Chapuis, wore yellow garments, garishly beaming about the sombre news. This move was seen as rather vulgar, but some have interpreted it as possibly being the king wearing the Spanish colour of mourning. But what cannot be disputed is the fact that the king made a great show of his daughter Elizabeth, and did celebrate with his courtiers. A rumour even went around court at the time that Catherine was poisoned by Anne or Henry. Henry ordered that Catherine should be buried with pomp and ceremony, however. It wasn't as a sign of respect. He deemed she should be buried as a dowager princess, making the point that he regarded that she was never legally his wife. It's considered today that the black growth that was found on Catherine's heart was cancer. However, to some it was evidence of poison. Her internal organs were removed during the embalming process to ward off decay, and possibly were buried in separate vessels with Catherine's body. Or they could have been placed in different locations. It was said that her body was opened, they took out her bowels, which were confined and buried solemnly in the chapel of St. James's Palace, her heart being separately enclosed in a coffin covered with purple velvet bound with silver. This was common at the time, people's internal organs being buried in different places, for example, the heart being placed in a different place to the body. Catherine's embalming process then continued, with her torso being stuffed with herbs and straw. Preserving spices and salts would then have been rubbed onto her body before it was wrapped in a waxed linen cloth. This wrapped the former queen up like a mummy, and she was then placed inside a coffin, but her body was not left alone. The body was left guarded and surrounded by candles for days, with her former ladies-in-waiting offering final moments of companionship. Surrounding the coffin were 4 large golden standards and crimson banners with the arms of England and Spain. Catherine's body was placed in a coffin, and the hearse was then taken to Peterborough Cathedral, and the funeral then took place. The hearse rested inside the cathedral for 3 days, with it being surrounded by 1,000 burning candles. Shortly before her coffin was interred into the floor below, a final mass was said, and Catherine of Aragon was finally laid to rest inside the floor of Peterborough Cathedral. It would seem that Henry did not want to create an exuberant tomb for her, and it was never very elaborate. However, unlike many churches in England, her tomb was left during the dissolution of the monasteries, as was Peterborough Cathedral. Today visitors still flock to see Catherine of Aragon's tomb, and it is surrounded at all times with flowers and pomegranates. Catherine's demise as Queen of England is a sad one, and one that is dominated by one of history's most brutal and notorious kings, questing greatly after a male heir, and with his eye being caught by a younger woman who herself fell harshly from grace. Catherine of Aragon is remembered as a woman of strong morals, of faith and of modesty, of which she was greatly respected for during the Tudor period.
Queen Anne Boleyn was the second wife of Henry VIII, and she is best remembered for being the executed wife who lost her head within the walls of the Tower of London. She was a prisoner of the former place where she awaited for her coronation as queen, but she had been the victim of the schemes of Henry VIII and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell. Anne was accused of treason, adultery and incest. However, it's known obviously that her cause of death was beheading by sword. The sword of the French executioner came crashing onto her neck. But there was much more to her execution than just this, as her real cause of death was the lies of the other men that collaborated to bring down her downfall to allow the king to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. In this video we look at the specific execution blow to Anne Boleyn and what the effects of this would be, as her body was later discovered under the floors of the chapel, St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was buried following the swing of the sword. What is the post-mortem of Anne Boleyn? Anne Boleyn as a queen was shrouded in great controversy throughout her entire reign as the Queen of England. Many women hated her across the nation, and they regarded her as a homewrecker who destroyed Henry's marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The king tried everything that he could think of to get rid of his first wife, but he eventually declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and he then led a number of hugely sweeping changes with the church that led to the monasteries being closed and religious houses and their wealth being absorbed into the coffers of the royal family. But Anne, during her married years, did give birth to the greatest Tudor monarch of all, Elizabeth I, but her failure to provide the king with a male heir also led to her great fall. This was one of the biggest causes of her downfall. After a number of miscarriages, the king looked elsewhere, and specifically towards Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Henry VIII had grown very tired of Anne, and Jane was seen as the woman who could give the king his heir. But to get rid of Anne, the king ordered Thomas Cromwell to come up with a number of false charges and false pieces of evidence that could see her accused of a number of crimes. One thing to consider is that at the time there had never been a noblewoman executed, so when Henry VIII would do what he'd do would be earth-shattering, ordering the execution of his wife. Anne herself had many enemies at court, and she would never have believed that her husband would turn against her. But alongside her were 5 other men, including her own brother, who were accused of adultery. But these men were executed following their trial, with the axe smashing down on their necks upon Tower Hill. One of these men, a musician inside of the court, was tortured, and he confessed. On the 15th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn, who had been held inside of the Tower of London, was sentenced to death for her crimes. Her trial was already predetermined, as the other men before her had been sentenced to death, so it was clear what her fate would be. Cromwell manipulated those men who heard the charges into ensuring Anne was proven guilty. But still at this point she would never have believed that she would be executed a short distance from the King's Hall where she was condemned to death. It would have seemed impossible for Henry to order his wife's execution, but Cromwell's case against her had evidence in abundance, and also testimony against the Queen. The former lawyer had brought down his more prized defendant, the Queen of England. It was this false case that led to Anne's execution inside the walls of the Tower of London, and nothing else. Anne is considered a victim today, and she was not guilty of what she was said to have done. On the 19th of May 1536, inside the walls of the Tower of London, the Constable of the Tower, William Kingston, wrote that, "This morning she sent for me, that I might be with her at such time as she received the good Lord, to the intent I should hear her speak as touching her innocency, always to be clear." He later went on to say, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." And then she put her hands about it, laughing heartily. "I've seen many men and also women executed, and that they have been in great sorry. And to my knowledge this lady has much joy in death." Before dawn on the 19th of May, she had called the constable to hear mass with her, and she prayed she had never been unfaithful to the king. She was given the sacrament, and she was then told to ready herself, as the executioner was waiting. But Anne Boleyn left the royal apartments, and she was surrounded by 4 ladies who attended on her, and they followed the Constable of the Tower as he led the procession of the dead to the scaffold, which had been built on the north side of the White Tower. Today this would be where the Waterloo barracks are, and where the crown jewels are held, but Anne was known to have been rather positively looking, and she was said to have walked confidently to her death whilst hundreds of witnesses were watching. The doors to the tower had allegedly been left ajar, and some managed to sneak in to look. Anne then made a speech to the crowd and said, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. He was ever a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord. This I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." Grown men wept as they heard her talk, and she also thanked her women for their service. But then the executioner was given a sack of coins as payment for carrying out a quick job, and a job on her neck that would not be botched. This was almost seen as a bribe. One of her ladies then placed a blindfold over her eyes, and she knelt on her knees and said a final prayer. Her final words were, "O Christ, receive my spirit." And then the executioner unleashed his sword from behind a bale of straw, and the crowd gasped. The executioner's assistant made a noise, and Anne looked that way, and she did not see her executioner coming, and within seconds, from the other direction, her executioner swung the sword and struck Anne Boleyn's head clean off. Following the blade crashing on her neck, Anne's heart would have beaten 1 or 2 more times, and the blood from her ruptured arteries would have poured out onto the scaffold.
It was a very quick end. But then in the reign of Queen Victoria in the 19th century, the body of Anne Boleyn would be discovered under the floor of the chapel. But then a royal doctor, Dr. Frederick Mowat, would perform an investigation on Anne Boleyn's remains. Centuries after her death, he wrote that the remains of the executed queen, he documented that they belonged to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was that next to the skull, bearing witness to the queen's little neck. He then stated, the bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of her life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Dr. Mowat stated that the woman in this grave would have been around 5 foot to 5'3" tall in her life, and he confirmed that the head was severed from the body of this woman. This obviously narrowed down the true identity, as there were only a few women who were beheaded on Tower Hill or inside of the tower, including Margaret Pole, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey. He also stated that the neck of the woman was small, which Anne Boleyn was noted for, and he confirmed without a doubt that the remains he had analysed were of Anne Boleyn. The post-mortem of Anne Boleyn confirmed that she had died via decapitation using a very sharp weapon. It also confirmed a number of stories that the Queen had a little neck. However, what it is meant is that the method of execution was quick and as harrowing as the stories which had been told for centuries later. Anne Boleyn was a woman who did not deserve this treatment.
Henry VIII was obsessed with having a male heir to succeed him onto the throne. This quest would lead him to even executing his second wife, Anne Boleyn, so that he could then marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. But Jane had a very tragic demise following giving birth inside of Hampton Court Palace. She gave the king his male heir in the form of Edward VI, but, as mentioned, Jane died. If she had not, then it's likely that Henry would not have become the king who is remembered for having 6 wives, but instead Henry would claim he was in mourning after Jane's death, but he quickly then began to search for another wife, because nothing says moving on like searching for another wife just weeks after the tragic loss of your third. But what did Jane Seymour die from, and what was the story of her post-mortem and the embalming process? It is believed that Jane Seymour was killed following a number of complications that had emerged following giving birth to Edward VI, the successor to her husband. During the Tudor period, giving birth was very dangerous, and it came with a lot of different risks, and because of this it was common for women to contract infections and other issues following giving birth, and also labour could go on for a very long time. One man who was present inside of Henry VIII's court was Nicholas Sander, who wrote and reported on what was happening during the king's reign. He was not the biggest fan of the king, but he claimed that around the time of Edward's birth that Jane Seymour was in severe labour in a difficult childbirth, and that all her limbs were stretched for the purpose of making a passage for the child. As others have claimed, having the womb cut before she was dead, so that the child ready to be born might be taken out. The travail of the queen being very difficult, the king was asked which of the 2 lives he wanted spared. He answered the boy's, because he could easily provide himself with other wives.
With this, the writer is claiming that Jane Seymour may have given birth to the king through means of caesarean section, but there is no evidence that claims this is true, and there were no records of this being performed before the 1580s. But what this writer also claims is that Jane was on death's door when this happened, but other records claim that she was visited following giving birth by other ambassadors, who then documented their meetings with her. There was some evidence that did state that Jane did give birth through this means, as in 1643, a century afterwards, Sir Richard Baker claimed that Jane was in labour for 6 long days, and that she begged doctors to cut her stomach to save her child and to end the process. But as mentioned, this is very unlikely. There were many other more prominent beliefs about her cause of death, and that Jane died from a fever that she sustained during childbirth, which is known as puerperal fever, and she may have also sustained an infection. There are no doctor records of her condition and treatment, however. Now, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, certainly went into labour in the afternoon of the 9th of October 1537, and around 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, Edward, her son, was born. It was claimed that she had signed letters that announced the birth of her son, putting questions about her dying earlier down, and ambassadors visited her in bed at Hampton Court to pass on their congratulations following the christening of Edward. This rules out the use of the caesarean, as she would have needed longer to recover, but as mentioned, this was not used early enough. But 4 days after giving birth to Edward, Jane reported that she was not well. Her physician documented her symptoms as a natural lax, by reason whereof she began to lighten and become more cheerful, and it appeared to mend, and so continued till towards the night. All this night she hath been very sick. Jane did slightly get better, and the next day there were no other reports that she had been suffering until the 19th of October. But then it was mentioned that Jane Seymour had taken a turn for the worse, and her condition then got significantly worse over the weekend. It was then clear to many who visited the Queen that she was not recovering well, and that she was in very severe danger and on death's door. Henry VIII was then summoned to her bedchambers at Hampton Court, and he prayed by his wife's side and stayed with her for some time, until he then left. He knew that his wife was dying, and on the 24th of October 1537 at 2 a.m, Jane Seymour died inside of Hampton Court Palace. The death of Jane was said to have been the fault of them that were about her, and suffered her to take great cold and to eat things which the fantasy in her sickness called for. But this report claimed that Jane had contracted food poisoning or some sort of stomach issue that caused problems for her. It also claimed that she had a very bad cold which led to a fever and then led to her dying. During the 16th century, it was common for people to get a cold or a fever, but there was no mention or specific knowledge relating to sepsis or an infection that caused blood poisoning. It is likely that Jane died from some form of sepsis, and prominent historians and medical officials are sceptical that she died from just a mere fever, as it was said that Jane had been seen hosting guests following the christening and eating rich food. They claim also that it was a significant time after that Jane may have contracted a fever from childbirth, but they suggest that the Queen may have had some form of embolism. It was inside of Hampton Court Palace where Jane died, and she would die in the same rooms where she gave birth, an apartment inside of the palace. But after Jane's death, Henry VIII went to Windsor to mourn, and he decided that his third wife should be buried within St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, in a special burial vault. The court was told to dress appropriately in mourning clothes, and they said that Henry VIII was even seen wearing purple, the colour of royalty. But the Duke of Norfolk was told to plan the funeral, and Jane's body was eventually taken from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle, and the King did not attend the funeral service. Jane Seymour had a huge and large funeral, and there were hundreds of masses to be sung for her soul, and Jane's body was embalmed, and this led to the removal of some of her internal organs. Jane's heart and intestines, as well as other organs, were cut out of her body, and then these were placed in separate containers and were then buried inside of Hampton Court's Chapel Royal, close to the altar. Jane's body had been dressed in a robe of gold, and a crown was placed on her head whilst she lay in state. Her body was taken to Windsor Castle for its burial, inside of the chapel there. Now the funeral procession arrived at the castle on the 10th of November, and there was a large amount of ceremony involved in her funeral. Jane was then led to rest with the full honours of a queen inside of a small burial vault beneath the Garter Chapel, and her 2 brothers witnessed the burial. The coffin was lowered into the vault, and her staff broke their staves of office inside of the grave to symbolise the end of their work. But bells rang out for hours across London, and it would be years later that Henry VIII was buried inside of the same vault as Jane Seymour. Over the next few decades and centuries, another burial was placed in the vault, that of the executed King Charles I. But Jane Seymour's coffin was noted to have been in a very good way, unlike that of her husband's, which was known to have been splintered and decayed open, and someone even tried to steal one of his bones. But Jane Seymour's cause of death was presumably a fever that took some time to take hold, or some form of illness that gripped her when she was weak after giving birth.
The most notorious king of England was Henry VIII, and he is most known for his 6 wives and his marriages that ended in tragedy and brutality. Henry ordered 2 of his own wives to be executed inside the Tower of London by axe and also sword, and he also saw his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, die inside of Hampton Court Palace following giving birth to the king's successor. But Henry's luckiest and most fortunate wife was Anne of Cleves, his 4th, who, following the dissolving of their marriage, received a huge amount of property and lived the rest of her life in comfort inside of royal palaces. She was waited on by her own household and was given the title of the king's sister. She also was the longest living of Henry's wives, and even outlived Henry's successor. But her own death was rather painful and prolonged. But what did Anne die from? Anne of Cleves came to England following the arrangements to marry Henry VIII being finalised. She arrived in England, and the marriage was doomed to fail from the very start. Anne was not the most well-educated compared to others, and she was skilled in needlework and enjoyed playing card games in her spare time. But she could only read and write in German, and she did not speak the best English. She was a gentle and calm woman, and was considered a good choice for the king. She was said to have been of middling beauty and a very assured and resolute countenance. She had a nice face, and another writer wrote, her hair hanging down, which was fair yellow and long, and she was apparelled after the English fashion with a French hood, which so set forth her beauty and good visage, that every creature rejoiced to behold her. She first met King Henry VIII in private on New Year's Day 1540, and it followed courtly love traditions as he entered the room in disguise, and Anne did not know who the king was and did not realise who her husband was. It was said that Henry so went up into the chamber where the said Lady Anne was looking out of a window to see the bull baiting, which was going on in the courtyard, and suddenly he embraced and kissed her, and showed her a token which the king had sent her for New Year's gift. And she, being abashed and not knowing who it was, thanked him, and so he spoke with her. But she regarded him little, but always looked out the window. And when the king saw that she took so little notice of his coming in, he went into another chamber, took off his cloak, and came in again in a coat of purple velvet. And when the lords and knights saw his grace, they did him reverence. It didn't go well. Anne offended the king greatly, and he also claimed that she was not as beautiful as he believed, and he felt that he had been sold a lie by Hans Holbein's painting. Anne did not realise who he was, and when the king told her who he really was, he was also put off the marriage. The pair met then on the 3rd of January 1540, and a huge celebration took place. But the king, following the marriage, claimed that he could not consummate the marriage, and he thought that his chief adviser, Thomas Cromwell, had sold him a lie. He claimed, "She is nothing so fair as she hath reported," and he continued to complain, but he could not get out of the marriage which occurred on the 6th of January inside the palace of Placentia. The marriage remained unconsummated, and Anne later said that her husband, that "when he comes to bed he kisseth me, and he taketh me by the hand,
and biddeth me good night, sweetheart, and in the morning kisseth me, and biddeth farewell, darling. But within months she was ordered to leave the royal court. She was informed her husband did not want to continue with the marriage. The annulment then went through on the 12th of July 1540, and after this Anne of Cleves was given a huge amount of land and also property. She was given the former home of Anne Boleyn, Hever Castle, as well as Richmond Palace, and she and her former husband remained good friends, and she was treated as the king's beloved sister. She also came to court, and Henry VIII enjoyed her company and conversation. But after the execution of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, some considered that he and Anne of Cleves should get back together, but instead he went for Catherine Parr, a woman that Anne did not like. Anne continued to live very carefully, and she then, in the years after, lived a quiet life. She was seen as a possible threat during the reign of Queen Mary I, as a Protestant rebellion emerged, and this also led to the future Queen Elizabeth I being locked up inside the Tower of London. She was closely associated with Elizabeth, and some thought she may have been plotting against the Queen. But by July 1557, Anne of Cleves was rather ill, and she got severely poorly as the months continued. She was quite ill for some time, and could not get out of bed, and Anne must have known that her death was coming, because she then drafted her last will, and she considered what to do with her possessions and objects. Anne claimed that there should be money left for people inside of her household to live, and she wanted her loyal attendants to be rewarded for their years of service. This included her grooms, ladies, gentlemen of the household, and every one of these people she listed by name, and this showed the amount of respect she had for these people. She also stated that her jewellery should be sent back to Germany and her family members, and that some of her rings and jewellery should then be sent to her stepdaughters, Mary I, and then the future Queen, Elizabeth I. Anne of Cleves was living inside of Chelsea Old Manor in the final days of her life. She died on the 16th of July 1557, and one theory as to what she died from was that she succumbed to cancer and that she had been suffering with this for months. The deterioration of her and the pain she was in alludes to this, and that she suffered with a serious illness before she died. It wasn't a sudden death. Following her death, Anne of Cleves was embalmed, and her vital organs were removed to be buried away from her body, and this included her heart being cut out, and the cavity was then filled with spices to keep away decay. She was then sent on a large procession to Westminster Abbey for her funeral. It was said of this that, on the 3rd day of August, my lady, Anne of Cleves, sometimes wife to Henry VIII, came from Chelsea to be buried in Westminster, with all the children of Westminster and many priests and clerks and the monks of Westminster, and my Lord Bishop of London and my Lord Abbot of Westminster rode together. Many of the prominent politicians of the time attended, and there were 100 torches burning, being carried by her servants. The procession was huge and large, and she was then taken into Westminster Abbey. Her coffin was then taken to her tomb, and she was interred with cloth of gold laid over her face. Following this, the officers of her household broke their staves of office and threw them into the tomb. The fourth wife of King Henry VIII was the luckiest wife of the Tudor king. She managed to live the rest of her life comfortably, but she would die from a terrible illness, and she knew that her death was on the horizon, which is rather troubling. One of the most tragic young women of the Tudor period was Henry VIII's teenage fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Many have considered the shocking age of the young victim of her husband, and Catherine was executed by axe inside the walls of the Tower of London. She was caught up in a shocking scandal, which involved her allegedly cheating on the king with one of his closest friends, but after the axeman had taken her head clean off in one swing from his instrument of death, Catherine's body was then taken inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower of London, and she was then thrown into a rough grave, and was allegedly covered in quicklime in an attempt to literally wipe her off the face of the earth, and to dissolve her remains in a quick manner, as the king wanted to forget about his fifth wife. However, Catherine's fate was very shocking when compared to that of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, who, despite also being executed, was allowed to be buried and was also executed by sword. But has the remain of Catherine Howard ever been found? Catherine Howard, as mentioned, was the fifth wife of Henry VIII, and her uncle was a prominent member of the King's court, the Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. He had been in service of the king for some time, and he managed to get Catherine a position in the court, serving in the household of Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. However, Henry quickly noticed the young teenage Catherine, and he shockingly sought to sleep with her, and he tried to woo her, and Catherine was approached to strike up a relationship with the king, who described her as the very jewel of womanhood, and Catherine was also said by other members of court to have been delightful. But the king was around 25 years older than her, at least. But after his terrible fourth marriage had been dealt with, Catherine Howard then married King Henry VIII on the 28th of July 1540, on the same day that his former close friend and chief adviser Thomas Cromwell lost his head on Tower Hill. But Catherine was not in a fit state to have become a queen. She was too young and carefree to get involved in important matters. She was also rather naive. But whilst the pair went on a honeymoon, Catherine grew closer with Thomas Culpeper, a courtier inside the court who usurped the king in the affections of his wife. And the pair may have, it's believed, even had a physical relationship behind the back of the king. They wrote love letters and had meetings arranged by a senior lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, and these liaisons were allegedly physical, and they were then discovered. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, investigated what was being spoken about at court, and he came across the love letter written by Catherine to Thomas. This was a pivotal piece of evidence in the saga and scandal, and the king, whilst he was praying inside the Chapel Royal within Hampton Court, was informed by Cranmer of his wife's adultery and her actions. She then lost the title of queen, and was then sent across to the Tower of London within days, and was kept under lock and key in the same place that her predecessor, the second wife of Henry, lost her head. Catherine must have known her time would be sometime soon up, especially as Thomas Culpeper and another man, Francis Derham, who had been condemned for their involvement with the Queen, were now dead. The pair were both executed, and their heads were placed above London Bridge as traitors, and the Queen may have even passed under the heads of her former lovers as she made her way by barge to the Tower of London, where she was then sent through Traitors' Gate. It was at 7 a.m. on the 13th of February 1542 that Catherine Howard was to be executed, and she spent the night before practising how to lay her head upon the executioner's block, so that her death could be without issue and problem, and be as quick as possible. Anyone who was sentenced to death in this way hoped that their execution would be in one swift strike of the axe. And let's remember that she was just a teenage girl. Some say she was 19 when she was preparing for her death. The executioner did not make a mess of the execution, and in one swift blow he took the head off of Henry VIII's fifth wife, and the blood of her spilled out all over the scaffold. Catherine was said to have stated that she deserved to die 1,000 deaths for the betrayal of her husband, the king, but her remains were then collected, and they were thrown into a roughly dug grave, or a hole, under the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But the king had instructed that her remains would be covered in quicklime, to make them decay quicker, as if Catherine had never existed. When we compare the treatment of Catherine to that of Henry's second wife, who was executed by sword, Catherine was given very little ceremony or respect in death. Her remains, it's believed, were not even collected and placed inside of a wooden box or chest, and there was only hay on the scaffold for her blood to be soaked up. She was given absolutely no funeral, and it's believed that everyone who witnessed her execution quickly made their exits from the tower to forget her, and those who buried her body did just that, without any words being said for her. She would have been wrapped inside of a cloth to collect her headless remains, and her head inside of, and these were then lowered into a roughly dug grave, and then the liberal amount of quicklime was placed over her remains. The effects of this would be that a lot quicker decomposition would take place. The remains of Catherine, as well as the cloth, would have decayed and rotted, and then there would be, as the king had hoped, very little left of her on this earth. He did not want her remembered. He did not want any grave for her. Henry wanted to probably forget the scandal of his fifth wife. However, during the reign of Queen Victoria, The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower of London, had a significant amount of restoration and repair, as Victoria did not believe the chapel was fit enough to house the remains of queens. The builders and specialists worked together and they dug up the bodies of a number of prominent people who were executed inside the Tower of London. Some of these figures had been executed on Tower Hill, and their remains were then brought into the chapel to be buried. A large amount of bones had been deposited inside the crypt, but the remains of Jane Boleyn, who helped the Queen cheat on the King, were found. There was a significant problem. The archaeologists and specialists managed to find the remains of many people who were identified. This included Anne Boleyn, the King's second wife, who was identified by the royal physician, who noted a number of characteristics, but because of Catherine's significance, there was a search carried out near to the high altar, but they could not find her body or skeleton. A small collection of bones, which had been strongly affected by the presence of quicklime, were discovered close to the body of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, another victim of Henry VIII, and these bones were then attributed to have been possibly belonging to the King's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. But there was never any DNA testing or any form of investigation which detailed exactly who these came from. If this investigation would have occurred, then the parts of the body could have been at least dated and attributed to either a male or a female. They could have also worked out roughly an age of the person who these belonged to, meaning there would have been a better chance that these may have belonged to Catherine. Much of her remains had gone, but this was something, a small part of a young queen who married the most tyrannical king England has ever seen, and she deserved much better, as she had been attributed today to have been more of an abused child than a plotting witch that she had been portrayed as in the past. Today the remains and body of Catherine Howard remain lost. Her body and skeleton has never been found, leading to the conclusion that Henry VIII got what he wanted, and that she was literally erased off the face of the earth upon his orders to dump copious amounts of quicklime on her. There is a memorial stone today inside the chapel, and many believe that this is a grave marker to the fifth wife of the Tudor king. However, this isn't the case, and there is simply no body that exists under the marker. One theory is that because of her age as a teenager when she was executed, that Catherine's bones had not hardened as they would have done if she was into full adulthood, meaning the lime would have got rid of her bones quicker. But Catherine Howard was a young girl who may have been led astray by one of the king's courtiers who had heard about her talents in the bedroom that the king preached about, and in the form of Thomas Culpeper, Catherine may have had a lot more in common with him rather than her large and huge husband. She had a horrific life, and she was led astray a number of times throughout her short time on the earth. But the treatment of her in death and what happened to her remains after her execution is also horrific, and Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was quite literally made to disappear, and nothing except that possible small collection of remains, which may be all of her, that exists.
Henry VIII is most infamously remembered today for the fact he had 6 wives, and he was a king whose final years were ruthless. He would execute 2 of his wives, turn on his closest friends, and he was known for his temper and short fuse. But the king also became huge and grotesque, and his final wife, Catherine Parr, is remembered today as a woman who was a survivor. The king's health had been in decline for a number of years following his jousting accident, and he was at the point where he was being carried around most of the time by courtiers, and he did very little walking of his own. But Catherine Parr is believed by many to be a woman who nursed the king, but she did not necessarily do this, and she even came close to losing her own head at one point. However, Catherine Parr would, following the king's death, get remarried rather quickly, and she would then fall pregnant for the first time in her life. This resulted, however, in her death, and following this she was buried nearby to the bedchambers where she passed away. But Catherine Parr's treatment in her death was brutal, and her tomb was opened a number of times. Catherine Parr's religious beliefs and ideas were considered very radical at the time, and her beliefs were against the king
in many respects, and some people believed that she was poisoning the mind of the king to make more strongly Protestant changes to the church. But inside of Hampton Court Palace, on the 12th of July 1543, she married Henry VIII, and she was then made the first Queen of England who was also appointed as the Queen of Ireland. She remained as the Queen until Henry VIII's death, and she would act also as a regent whilst the King was in France. But she was involved in the education of the Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. Following the King's death, she fell in love again with Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sudley, who came sniffing around as soon as the King had died. Catherine and Seymour had a history together, and Seymour was power-obsessed, and he saw marrying Catherine as an opportunity to get more power and closer to the throne. He thought he would never get permission to marry the deceased king's widow from the new king, Edward VI, or the Regency Council, which was established to rule on behalf of the boy king, who was Henry VIII's son, but Seymour and Catherine married in secret, and this was kept quiet for some time before the information came to light, and then there was a huge scandal. Catherine was seen as shameful, and Edward VI was not happy, but Catherine then encountered conflict with her brother-in-law Edward Seymour. Catherine Parr, despite never having been pregnant before or having any children, fell pregnant with the child of Thomas Seymour, and this was a huge surprise. At the time, Tudor childbirth was considered very risky and dangerous for any woman, and Catherine was slightly older at the time. This meant that any complication and consequences could have been fatal. And Catherine at the time was living at Sudley Castle, and whilst here she helped to educate the successor of Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen. But inside of her bedchambers, Catherine Parr would give birth to a girl on the 30th of August 1548, and she would never really recover from this, and on the 5th of September she would then pass away days after giving birth. Following her death, Thomas Seymour deserted the castle, and her funeral was arranged, and it became the first fully Protestant funeral to occur in England. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, and the remains of Catherine were prepared and embalmed inside of her bedchambers, and they were then taken to be buried inside of St Mary's Chapel in the grounds of Sudley Castle, where she died. For Catherine, a huge and ornate tomb was made for her, and this was placed in the north side of the chapel, and on it an effigy of Catherine was on top, and at the base was a Latin inscription. But over the next few centuries, the Queen's remains would be disturbed and messed around with to a huge extent. In 1642, the tomb of Henry VIII's sixth wife was destroyed during the English Civil War. Roundhead soldiers of Parliament's army arrived, and they smashed up the chapel, and they attacked Catherine Parr's tomb and desecrated the monument. But the body of Catherine was disturbed, and the grave was shattered, and it was said that "there is in the castle a goodly fair church. Here they dug up the graves, and disturbed the ashes of the death. They break down the monuments." But Sudley Castle was then attacked by Parliament, and the chapel roof was demolished, and for 200 years Catherine Parr's burial site was forgotten about. But in 1782, many people were looking to see new castles and sites, and a group of ladies arrived at Sudley to find the tomb of Catherine Parr. They found a block of alabaster marble from the tomb in the north wall, and some local men then dug beneath it, and 2 feet under the stone they found the lead coffin of Henry VIII's sixth wife. They opened the coffin, and they found the Queen's body tightly wrapped in cerecloth, and the women then cut this away, and they saw the face of the Queen for the first time in 200 years. But as her corpse was exposed to the fresh air, for the first time in centuries, the colour in her eyes turned a different shade, and they lost their light. The women then asked the men to rebury her body and to place it in the coffin, but then a local farmer found out about this, and he wanted to see the body of the Queen himself. It was said, "In the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Queen Kay Parr lay interred was removed, and at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more, a leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased, but to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth, which covered one of the arms of the corpses, the flesh of which was at the time white and moist. He made an incision and uncovered one of the arms, and he said the flesh was white and moist, and he also cut off a few locks of the Queen's hair as well, as some material from the cloth and her dress which she was buried in. In 1783, just a year later, the steward of the castle then directed for the grave to be opened again to see the Queen's remains, and it was said that the body had begun to decay quickly. It was also noted that shoes were on the feet which were very small, and that the Queen's proportions were extremely delicate, and that her hair was gold. 4 years later, the coffin of Catherine Parr was opened again, and a local priest was curious to see her body. He found that the head of the Queen had totally decayed and that teeth had fallen out of her mouth, and this must have been very scary to see. But he also found that the arms and her hand had turned brown, and then he recorded a sketch of her body. But yet again, her coffin would be open more times. 6 years later, a group of drunk vandals entered the chapel, and they took the body of Catherine Parr out of the coffin and messed with it, and some even danced with the corpse. They then dumped this in a pile and left, and removed some of the teeth, and one man allegedly stabbed an iron bar through the torso of the former Queen, before it was buried back in the ground, upside down. But then a local priest wanted to give the Queen a proper burial that he believed that she deserved. In 1817, the chapel was renovated, and the coffin of Catherine Parr was found upside down, and the body was now just a pile of bones with a small bit of flesh and hair on it. But then she was placed inside of a stone vault and tomb for the final time. She was given a new coffin, and this was also placed in the new tomb. On this coffin shows an effigy of Queen Catherine, with her hands tightly clasped together, and she is laid to rest still in this manner today. What happened to the remains of Catherine Parr was shocking, and her coffin was opened a number of times throughout the centuries after her death. But she was considered the lucky one of Henry VIII's wives who survived the brutality of the king. However, in her death, she was not fortunate, as what happened to her after was horrific inside of the small chapel in the confines of Sudley Castle.